Hello, everyone. We are going to get started in about 10 minutes. Stay tuned, stay in the line.
Rise of a new day, glowing in these lights, warming up my face as I lose my mind. Thought it was last night, happy and alive, to the time of shining. I had a little string, dazzled by the beams, troubled by my mind. I see these worlds are full of reasons. I have a thing to face. Am I kinda crazy? What am I trying to hide? Is my mind a lazy to the fight? All I want to know could even change my life. Will the light go down and the sunset? Or is it just another day? Everyone cannot hold my eyes to the false beauties. What I see is real. Dazzled by the beams, troubled by my mind. See these worlds are full of reasons. I have a thing to face. Am I kinda crazy? What am I trying to hide? Is my mind a lazy to the fight? All I want to know could even change my life. Will the light go down and the sunset? So I turn my mind, I'm a deep inside. Seek another feeling, but the final close of eyes. It's all I say. Am I kinda crazy? What am I trying to hide? Is my mind a lazy to the fight? All I want to know could even change my life. Will the light go down and the sunset? Am I kinda crazy? Is my mind a lazy to the fight? All I want to know, could if I change my life, will the light go down in the sunset? Or is it just another day? The night comes and I am waiting. I'm feeling greedy for surprise. It's been some time that I am waiting. That's no motion in my life. Go! My mind's flying far away from where I'm living. I'm floating in my head. My lungs slowly turning when the smoke is ceiling on everything that I am. I'm my way doing silly actions. I keep on going against conscious reactions. I'm my way doing silly actions. I keep on going, whatever. Well, I'm afraid serving the people that I'm meeting. What I know by your image. The time's passing and I'm wasting with a tiger. Picture that remain. I'm my way doing silly actions. I keep on going against conscious reactions. I'm my way doing silly actions. I keep on going, whatever. to time this way. Floating as the wind is blowing. Passing my time looking through the sky. And see if I were just out the hands. Sailing across this wave is where I am living my life. Be free when I precise. Beyond the night, right now the passion and the master it makes me understand that happiness is double like this. On my way doing silly actions. I keep on going, I just go sense reactions. On my way doing silly actions. I keep on going, whatever. On my way doing silly actions. I keep on going, I get reactions. On my way doing silly actions. I keep on going, I just go sense reactions.
Hello, João. You there,
Hey.
man?
I can hear you. Can you guys hear me?
I cannot hear you.
You can't hear me?
You can hear me?
Yes.
Fine, but there's maybe problems with your microphone.
Can you hear me?
I would suggest you to sniff in the settings control room.
Can you hear
At
me?
the top of the Hangouts, you have a settings. It's like an engine icon. You click on it, and then you have your devices. You probably need to change your microphone device.
Can you hear me?
I still cannot hear you.
Now.
All right, guys, in the line, we will get started in a Sitecore user group soon. We're still setting up here. We're almost there.
Me ouvem? Me ouvem? Vocês conseguem me ouvir?
Hey, João. I can
Hey.
hear you now, man.
Okay, good. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Just a second. Can you say that again?
Can you hear me? Testing.
Yes, perfect. Perfect.
Yeah, I can hear myself. There's some echo.
Oh, really? Can you still hear yourself?
Yes. Try muting you. Yeah, now I don't hear myself. Did you mute you?
No. It's all fine here.
Okay. So,
all right. João, if you want to get to share your desktop, you can get started.
Yeah. Let's first of all learn how okay, screen share. Then I'm gonna share it. Probably should turn my camera off just to save some bandwidth. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, so whenever say we can start.
Okay, thank you, João. Before we get started, I would just like to say some words. This is our second Sitecore as a group in Brazil in 2018. Today we will have João Neto, our friend, straight from Netherlands. He's going to discuss Sitecore 9 forms and some interesting subjects on whether or not to adopt that. And Vinicius and Daniel Roberge is going to talk about GDPR and Sitecore 8. All right, so I'm gonna mute myself. It's all with you, João. You can get started.
Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks for joining session today about if it's time for you to migrate to Sitecore 9 forms. First of all, let me do a brief introduction. My name is João Neto and Sitecore MVP. Currently working for Virtual Affairs and live in the Netherlands. Yeah, so I want to start to doing a brief introduction to the Sitecore forms and also to the web forms for marketers. So let's first talk about web form for marketers. It's a Sitecore module that's available since Sitecore 6. It's also available with the new release of Sitecore 9. And it's a separate module that you need to download, which basically gives the content authors the ability to create, insert new forms, add fields, submit buttons, and also gives you some web analytics and reporting capabilities. It's a well-known module by the developers. Also, there's some jokes about it, how much headaches it causes when you need to add some customizations. So this module has been using for many years, and you find many blog posts and many things how to work around this module. And now with the release of Sitecore 9, we have the new brand redesigned Sitecore forms. So it's available since the initial release. They give you a complete redesign user experience. So basically drag and drop, text box, labels, and new fields, which is different than the web form for marketers, which uses the click and add approach. So you click in one field and then add more. With the Sitecore forms, you can simply drag and drop. It's built using the Speak3 technology. It comes with the out-of-the-box multi-step forms, and it brings new things for you, such as you can save your forms or templates to be reused by others marketers, and it will replace web form for marketers in the future. And also something really nice is that everything you do in your Sitecore forms is on IT. So let me do a quick demo. I want to show you how it works, show some nice features it presents. So I hope our demo works. So when you first log into Sitecore, you see in the Sitecore Launchpad the icon forms. It comes with the installation, so you don't have to do anything to get installed. Once you have your Sitecore 9 installed, you already have your Sitecore forms. And then the first screen you see is the Sitecore Forms application, where you see all your forms but also the forms are created by users. So if you want to see the forms that only your users created, you can go to My Forms. For example, this form named Visit Us was created by my username administrator. And also I can see the templates that I created. So as you can see, you have this screen where you can filter the forms, you can edit, you can export the data, and also you can see some analytics data by form and also by the field. So you can see how the end user is interacting with your form. Now let's go and create a new form. When I go to create form, I see my template available, and I can also choose to create a new blank form. So like I said, it's quite easy now for you to design a new form. Is basically everything is drag and drop. So for example, I want to drag a new session. I just go click here, and then I can easily add new fields, text, label with text, multiple line text. And also I can create multi-step forms. For example, I add a new page, and then I add a new session, and then I add a new button to navigate to my next session. And then here I say, go to the next step. So by adding the submit button, when you add the next step, he's going to jump your form to the next page. Also, I can easily apply all the style I want. So if you have a CSS class, you can basically type the information here for the field and also for the label. So for example, if I go to this button here, because it's bootstrap behind of the scene, I can easily use the bootstrap classes. So but btn primary, and then I save, and I see immediately the results of my changes. Also, you have something really nice with the fields lists, where you can either type fixed values or you can point to a data source. So for example, when I come to list items, I can say, yeah, I want static key items. So I say item 1, add the new, item 2, add the new, item 3. But also have the option to select the data source, point to somewhere in my content tree, and say, for example, that the name is the value field and the text field is the display name, and then I click save, and I can see my data source. So those, except for the field video, those are the fields that you have out of the box. Also, you can easily customize it. And you can save your form as a template. So if I, for example, come here, save form, and then I say save the form as a form template, form 1. And then I can see it, form 1, and then I can see my new template here in the templates. And then whenever I go to create a new form, I have my form template available. And like I said, everything is an item. So by default, every form and every template you create goes to the Sitecore forms. And as you can see, I have my form 1 and form 1 template, and everything becomes on white. So here's my page 1, my second page, the session I created, and I can easily change it also from the content tree. Also, in order to customize is very easy. You have a really nice documentation and some nice blog posts how you can add, for example, custom submit actions. Submit actions are actions that are done once you click the submit button. For example, if you want to save the data, if you want to synchronize some data, if you want to save a log, some things like that, you go with the submit action. By default, Sitecore comes with some submit actions such as the trigger goal, trigger campaign, activity, uh, outcome, send email, redirect to page, and save data. But you can easily create your custom one. For example, for the log submission, you basically have to go to system and add a new settings, a new submit action, point to a class in your project, and this class just needs to inherit from the submit action base. And basically you, in the execute, you can manipulate and do whatever you want with the form fields. Okay, switching back to my presentation. Now let's do a comparison between the Sitecore forms and web form for marketers. So the first thing to point out is the installation. With web form for marketers, like I mentioned, you need to download, install the web form for marketers from the Sitecore developer network. Also, you have some post-installation steps. You have to do some changes in the web configuration file and also with a placeholder. And in Sitecore 8 and previous version, you can't install it without MongoDB. MongoDB is a requirement for the web form for marketers. Now with Sitecore Forms, it comes with the Sitecore 9 installation. There is no additional step after installing Sitecore, except that you need to, once you have a fresh installation, you need to run a reindex. So you need to have your Solr fully configured, and you need to run a reindex and Sitecore. That's something that developers notice. If you don't run it once you have your fresh installation, you're not going to see any form or anything that you create. The form applications page will show blank. So form fields. A Sitecore form is new. You can see you have less fields than the web form for marketers, and also the concepts change. So Sitecore forms calls the fields, they are called form elements, and they are split between 4 categories. And meanwhile, Verify for Max has 3 categories and has more fields than Sitecore forms. So some of the fields we can point out is they are missing in the Sitecore forms is the SMS, telephone, file upload. These ones you're probably gonna miss. So I hope in the next release of Sitecore they provide us with this one. A captcha field, a credit card field, and that's it. So styling with both Sitecore forms and web form for marketers, you can add styling. The only difference is that web form for marketers comes with some predefined style options, while Sitecore forms is fully customized. So it comes with Bootstrap by default, but you can add your custom CSS classes. So both have this flexibility to be customized. With regards to security and privacy standards, Sitecore Sitecore does not encrypt the information it captures from forms in the web file format. It also does not encrypt any information it captures from Sitecore forms. So is a limitation from both. In the case of web file formatters and also for Sitecore forms, if you want to encrypt the data that you save in your database, you need to add a custom encryption. And but also what's nice from Sitecore forms, it's the support encryption at rest. So you basically enable encryption in your database, and unless the unless the person that is has a copy of the database, unless he has the certificate, he won't be able to install a copy of your database locally. So but it is not a feature that's enabled by default. You have to enable. It is something that is supported by SQL Server. And for the web form formatters, in order to give access to all features in web form formatters, you need to assign the following roles. While with Sitecore forms, just have one role that you can assign, and then the user will have access to the Sitecore forms. So with regards to validation and workflow, both web form formats and Sitecore forms, they don't support workflow, but they support field validation. Although with Sitecore forms, you can customize the error per field. When with web form formats, you can show a custom error message for every field. Web form format supports form verification, which is basically when you submit the form is some additional verification. For example, if the user that's submitting the form is authenticated and so on, which is not supported by Sitecore forms. And behind the scenes, Sitecore makes the validation in the client using jQuery validate. So if you're familiar with this library, you can easily customize the validation or add anything additional steps for the Sitecore forms. So save and submit actions. Web form formats, they are called save actions. In Sitecore forms, they are submit actions. They're basically additional steps that are done once you click the button submit. As you can see in this comparison, web form formats has a long list of custom submit actions, while Sitecore forms is new. It doesn't offer many of these options, so we hope in future release there will be more. So the latest release was introduced the send email campaign message, but it's quite a bit limiting because it only works with EXM, and also the email must be the user must be a contact in your XM. But we have recently a blog post from Rodrigo giving us a guide how you can create a custom send email without the need of registering the user to as a contact in your database. So you can basically send emails to anyone that subscribed to your form, and it doesn't need to be previously registered in your EXM. But you can see, for example, in Webflow for Marketers, you have many more options, not only those, but also integration with CRM Dynamics and others that you can install separately. Up to this presentation, we don't have anything, any integration, external integration available for Sitecore forms, which is the next topic I'm going to mention. Webform for marketers, and you can find from the Sitecore website connector to CRM Dynamics, which once you save the action, you synchronize the data from the form into your CRM. And also at Sitecore Marketplace, you can find third-party connectors such as Salesforce, Loqua, and etc. But now it's a limitation for these Sitecore forms. If you really need to integrate Sitecore forms with Microsoft Dynamics now, you probably need to consider developing a custom submit action or using data exchange framework to run it for you. So unfortunately, there is this limitation now. So the question is supposed, having said it all, is it time? So I should migrate to Sitecore forms? And the answer for that, and the answer for many things is, it depends. It depends how you're using web form for marketers or any other custom form. And if you have all the features that you need, if all the features that you need, they are available in Sitecore forms now. So integration with CRM Dynamics or other systems is a limitation now, which you need to consider whether or not you go to the option of create a custom one. Also, the fields that are missing. So whether or not you're going to need to implement custom fields. And also, I show here a comparison between what you have available and what could be missing in Sitecore forms. So, for example, form verification, like I told, integrations with other external systems is also something that is missing. So, if you don't really need any of those integrations, so I'd say, yeah, go ahead, migrate your forms. Uh, Unfortunately, um, there is no tool that migrate web farm for marketers to Sitecore forms. There is not such a thing available. So you take from your development team some effort to uh, move from web farm for marketers to web forms. But I can say is very easy, is very straightforward to add customizations and implement new and cool features in Sitecore forms. Some resources I can give you to get more information about it. One blog post that I wrote last year about doing this comparison and also pointing everything that I mentioned here. The also new blog post from Rodrigo where you can create a custom send email actions to Sitecore 9 without needing to use EXM. The new blog post from Michael Reynolds giving you some insights on how you can encrypt Sitecore experience forms on database, and also some blog posts for webfire for marketers where you can learn more about it. And yeah, so far, is there any questions? I'm gonna open now the session for questions, so feel free to post them.
Okay, I will wait for people to make questions online. If any questions appear, I would like to ask you your personal opinion about the state of Sitecore 9 forms, how that has been released, and I'm not sure if you are aware of any intentions of Sitecore to improvements in this module.
Yeah, from that, what I heard, there is many intentions. Probably we're gonna have more things in the next releases. So I can, from what I can feel, Sitecore is investing heavily in Sitecore farms, and web farm for marketers would be something in the past. So um, if you're not considering migrating now, you probably should have it in your roadmap, because it'll probably come as a surprise on Sitecore Forms is uh, sufficient enough to provide everything that Webform for Max was providing. So in the next releases, you might be surprised by not having support for Webform for marketers anymore. So my personal opinion is uh, it seems to be better than Webform for marketers, the way for a developer to customize it, although it's a bit basic, some things like we could see. But yeah, mm, I'm very happy with this one. So since I started to work with Sitecore, my first task was to add a custom field to a web farm for marketers, and I see how trouble was it, how difficult it was to add a custom field, and now I can see how easy it is to use in the forms.
Edipo has a question. Can we use personalization with Sitecore forms to show different fields dependent on something?
No, it's not supported currently. I know it is supported by WebFire for marketers, where you can use personalization to show and hide fields, but that's some limitation now. So if you want it, you're gonna need to work this around from the client perspective. So some custom JavaScript files you need to add and tweak it. I don't know how difficult it is, but yeah, it's not available. I know it's a feature available from Web Form for Market, but that's not something available for Sitecore Forms now.
I would say a correction. It's not personalization what we use in web form for marketers, but rules. And
yeah,
I think the. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I guess the only way of using personalization the way we do with a component will be to show maybe one form or another, depending on a personalization, because the form itself is a component. But individual fields, yeah, I've been searching for that. It's not possible yet as well.
Yeah, that's precisely correct. So now that I mentioned, so if you want to add a form, so you have, as you have in the web format, you have in the forms a rendering that comes out of the box, where you select its name MVC form, and then you select which form you want to show. And yes, you can personalize which form you want to be displayed or not, but you can't add in the level of the field. Everything needs to be worked with JavaScript, for example, if they use select one value from one field and then you want to another field to be shown, that's not possible to do out of the box.
Okay, cool. Any other questions? All right. Cool. Well, thank you for your presentation, João. And thanks for your reference for my module. I'm planning just to announce that in the middle of development of authentication toolkit for Sitecore 9 forms that will allow us to log in user, log out, change password, and etc. All right. If anyone has anything else to add? No? All right. Thank you, João, for your participation. Thank you. Very appreciated. And we'll get back in about 10 minutes with Daniel Roberge and Vinicius Deschamps on GDPR with Sitecore. Everybody's running to it. We'll get back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Just one more second to set up things here. We're gonna get started. All right, we're good to get started. In this presentation, Vinicius and Daniel Roberge are going to speak on GDPR plus Sitecore. We're good to get started. It's all with you.
Can you guys hear me correctly? Just testing my mic.
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good.
Okay, so why don't you get things started, Daniel? And I will pass the presentation as soon as you tell me to do it.
Okay. Boa noite. Tudo bem?
Tudo bem? Como vai?
Good. Eu me desculpo, não vou poder fazer minha apresentação em português. So good evening, everybody. So I wanted to thank everybody for inviting me to this presentation. So GDPR and Sitecore. So let's start the presentation. I think GDPR is definitely a hot topic these days, especially for international organizations. I'll go into some of the details about what GDPR is and work with Vinicius here in order to be able to make the link back to Sitecore and the application and the platform. So let's move forward. So the agenda for this evening. So we'll talk a bit about more about who we are, what the GDPR concepts are all about, some of the data protection principles associated with this new European law, the concept of understanding what processing is all about. Then we'll get into the application of Sitecore and GDPR and what it all means. And sort of get into some of the sort of the Sitecore 9 features and functionality that may be available to you in order to be able to make sure that the solution that you're building for clients is GDPR compliant. And as well, we'll have Q&A session, but I would encourage everybody to, if you have any questions during the presentation, to please pipe up and ask them now. I think it's probably better if we have a topic that you want to cover or a question you have as I'm discussing the various aspects of this presentation, as opposed to waiting till the end of the presentation. So my name is Daniel Roberge. I head up the IT operations in North and South America for Valtech. Valtech, I was previously to that with a company called Nonlinear Creations. Most of you around the table this evening are familiar with it. And Nonlinear Creations was acquired by Valtech last year, about a year or so ago. With this new role, I've taken on different capacities and different roles, but I've been involved with the IT industry for the past 23 years. And right now, I'm also an active member on the Global GDPR Directorate, which is a group within Valtech that was put together in order to be able to ensure that Valtech is GDPR compliant. Valtech is a global digital agency with 2,500 employees over 18 different countries. So our breadth and our scope in terms of global presence is definitely important, and GDPR not only affects our operations in Europe, but also across the globe. So that's a bit about myself.
Okay, so I will be presenting with Daniel Roberge. So my name is Vinicius Deschamps. I'm also playing a role in Valtech. I'm a system administrator. I have 10 years plus playing system administrator roles. I am a Microsoft Certified Solutions Associate, and for 2 years in a row, I have been awarded with the Sitecore MVP. And I will be talking a little bit more about the Sitecore and GDPR features. So let's get started with GDPR.
All right, so the key concept of GDPR. So what is GDPR? The General Data Protection Regulation, which is what it stands for, is essentially a unique European law that takes effect this Friday, May 25th. The whole purpose of this law is to essentially put in practice the protection of privacy rights for EU citizens. So everybody living in the European Union is essentially covered by this new law. This law sort of applies to not only public and private organizations that process personal information about European citizens. And I'll get into some of what personal processing means in a few seconds. Unfortunately, vendors, everybody that is involved with any type of clients that deal with European citizens are essentially bound by this legislation. And this is sort of new for this new law. In the past, privacy laws sort of made vendors exempted from information processing, but this new law essentially makes it that everybody, not only the client, but also the vendors associated with these clients, responsible for many of the components associated with personal data. Move on to the next slide. So you might think, well, this is a European law, so why does it affect us? Well, GDPR is definitely European, but the fact is that you have European citizens that live all over the world. So it also impacts organizations located outside the European Union, and organizations that not only offer services and goods, but may also be involved with processing. So if you're an organization, or you're working for an organization, or your clients are working for clients that deal with customers that are potentially European citizens, this law applies to your organization as well. Let's move on to the next slide. So what do we mean by personal data? Well, personal data is really defined as information that you can directly or indirectly identify to a natural person. So name, photo, location data, IP address, online identifiers, etc. There's also what the GDPR has done is that it also has identified a subcategory to the personal data. So not only about name, photo ID, location, address, etc., but the subcategory is what we call sensitive personal data. So it's information that on one's race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, political opinions, biometric data, health data, any information that is sort of personal and more sensitive. Those is called sensitive data, and there's activities and processes within the law that basically ensures that, making sure that we safeguard this personal information about personal data. So if part of your activity is to actually deal with sensitive health information, or you have clients that are dealing with customers with health information specific to their health or biometric information, then specific activities and provisions within your processing needs to be taken into account in order to make sure that this personal information does not get into the wrongful hands. Let's move on to the next slide, Vinicius. So in the GDPR legislation, we talk about processing. What is processing of information? Well, the processing of information really comes down to any activity that has to do with collecting, handling, storing, managing, processing, interpretation, manipulation, doing inferences, especially when we're talking about big data. Any type of manipulation that you're doing with the data is called processing. And the players involved with the manipulation. So it's important that we understand that during the processing aspect, it's super important that the processing is clearly identified and that there's activities and information around safeguarding of that data during the processing that is taken care of. So it's the difference with this new law is that in the past, the processing wasn't really part of the whole legislation. But it's what we're seeing now is that the service providers like us, like Valtech, or like customers that you may be involved in, or vendors that you're involved in, are now sharing the responsibilities that associated with the collection of data. So it's not only about the customer, the client that owns the data, but it's also the vendors like us that are associated with processing of the information that is also responsible for safeguarding that data. Any questions on this?
Not so far, Daniel.
All right. So let's get into what we mean as an example. So you have three columns in front of you now. So on the left-hand side, you've got the data controller. As part of the GDPR legislation, when we talk about controller, we mean the client or the customer, the person that actually owns the data. So for Valtech, for instance, our clients, we work on behalf of our clients. They are the controller. They are the people that own the data in the end, and therefore they have certain responsibilities. Under the legislation, the processor, meaning the vendor or whoever is responsible for the processing of the activity. And that can be a vendor like ourselves, or it could also be somebody like hosting the data in the cloud, whether it be Amazon or Azure. So Microsoft or Amazon in those instances would become the processor of that information, because when the legislation defines processing as also storage of information, storing of personal data. So the processor here could be the cloud providers. And on the right-hand side, we talk about the data subjects. Oh, sorry, we're not too fast there. One back, please. The data subjects. So in this example, you've had the data subjects, the people visiting a website, as this example is. So you may have customers going to somebody's website and wanting to fill out a form to sign up for an actual newsletter. This information would then be filled out on the website. The website would collect the person's email address, first name, last name, maybe an address of some sort, and that would become part of the data that's being collected. And what would happen in that example is that the subjects submit this information. The processor would then collect the information and pass that on through a database, and then would store this information at the client or at the customer's data warehouse. In the information that is being collected, we need to also collect information around the consent, or why the information has been captured in the first place. So the GDPR talks a lot about the fact that it's not only about collecting the information, but it's also putting together in place pieces of evidence throughout the processing that is important. So not only is it important to collect the information, but you need to sort of stamp that collection of information to say, Danielle Robert signed up for a newsletter on the website XYZ on this date. He has given, by submitting his information, he has given his consent for the company to use that information. So all this information, all the tracking along the way, is necessary in order to be able to make sure that you're compliant with GDPR legislation. Any questions on this?
Nothing so far, Daniel.
Okay.
I believe that we will wait until the end of the presentation to compile all the questions, Daniel,
Okay.
to not stopping the presentation.
Okay, very good. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So when we talk about individuals' privacy rights, so what this legislation has done is that it's actually redefined the user's rights. So what we mean by this is that the key concepts here is that the individual's privacy rights are under 6 specific tenets. So the user must have now, or the personal information is essentially consists of 6 different components. The user has the ability for valid consent. So the organization must follow tighter rules when it comes to obtaining consent from individuals. It's no longer acceptable to think that because we've collected a name in a database from a trade show somewhere, that the user has given consent for the use of his personal information. That no longer applies. It has to be clearly defined, has to be explicitly defined, and it has to be in such a way that the user understands what he's given consent for. So, so all these tenets have to be respected. This legislation also talks about transparency. So the ability to know what personal data will be collected and how it will be used. So the user has the right to be able to understand what that company will be doing with that information and what it's going to, and for how long they're going to be using that information for. So transparency of data is part of this, the individual's privacy rights. The third tenet is about correction. So the ability for the user to say, hey, I've changed my address, I'm going to go, or my home physical address, or my email has changed, I want to go to the public's website and say, hey, please remove or at least modify the ability to make changes to my name. So if you want to make changes to your name or part of your personal information that is stored on somebody's website, then you have the ability to make those corrections or ask the user, the controller, to give you access so that you can make those changes. The fourth tenet is the right to erase. So the user has the ability to go back to company XYZ and say, hey, the information that you have on me as an individual, I would like you to delete that information from your database. And as the controller, you are now obligated to actually erase that information from the database. And you need to provide proof that you've deleted and that name no longer resides in your possession. The fifth tenet is about data portability. Data portability means that if you have your name at one vendor's site, for instance, and you decide to say, hey, I will no longer want to be part of this vendor's website, I want to move on to somebody else's website, then you have the right to actually move, ask the vendor to send the information off to somebody else's website. So the right to be able to move your data from one vendor to another and to be able to ensure that you have proof of that moving. And then we talk about the last tenet is automated processing. So the right to not be subject to decisions that are based on automated processes. So here, for instance, we talk about profiling based on what a person has done when they've collected information from a shopping cart. So Amazon, for instance, the ability to say that based on what I purchased in my purchase history, you are now providing me information based on my the information that you've collected on me based on my behavior. So if you're doing that because you're looking at, we have the ability to do that, then the user has to provide proper consent to the company to be able to allow for them to provide in that type of information. So just being careful that technology is available and we can do a lot of good things with it, but being mindful of what that technology can do on end users' personal data is strictly defined within the GDPR legislation. Next. So one of the things I want to talk about is the obligations on organizations about what GDPR means. So right now, there's an accountability component that needs to be mindful. So organizations must demonstrate compliance by maintaining records of all data processing activities. And this is super important, especially when you're defining the solution for your end customer, is that you need to provide hooks or ability to provide evidence along the way that throughout the processing of the personal data, you have the ability to prove that either you've obtained consent, that you've saved the consent, either you've deleted somebody's personal information from the database, or that you're no longer using it in your database. These are now mandatory. So organizations must provide evidence of all the processing activities associated with that. Organization also must put in place data protection or must have sort of data protection impact assessments, what we call DPIAs. And these are mandatory for processing of the activity. And these DPIAs, or data protection impact assessment, is a test on whether the processing associated with somebody's personal data is going to consist of personal information. So for instance, if you set up a website and you're saying we're just going to be collecting people's email addresses and that's it, then we know that this personal information is not enough to be able to identify that to an individual or to a very specific individual. So what you must do, you must provide sort of a DPIA, which is an internal test to be able to determine that the processing doesn't impact or does not infringe on the GDPR legislation. And so that piece of evidence must follow that client or that project in order to make sure that if at some point the authorities are asking, asking the organization, did you provide or did you put in place a DPIA for that specific processing? So this is a test that needs to be put in place within organizations in order to be able to make sure that they're compliant. Data security, so keeping score of personal data is secure and the appropriate technical and organizational measures are in place. So if I'm putting together a database, I want to make sure that the database is secure. What type of security do I have on it? Do I have restricted access to it? Only the people working on it will be able to gain access. So everything that is associated with data security needs to be put in place for that organizations that is collecting personal data from EU citizens. Moving on to the next slide. Also, organizations must put in place that, in the event of a data breach, they need to report the data breach within 72 hours to the GDPR authority. This is critical so that, if at some point personal data has been compromised, the authorities are alerted and that information has been shared with them in order to be able to mitigate and to deal with this specific breach. The other tenet is that every organization must put in place a data protection officer, somebody that is independent from sort of the operation, that will ensure that if a customer calls up or sends an email to say, hey, I'd like to know what information I have associated with your organization, that this information will go to an individual or a group that will manage those types of requests. In the event that somebody has a complaint with your organization, they need to go to someone, and that someone has to be sort of independent of the the operations and be able to take those complaints and act them within the organizations. And the legislation, the GDPR legislation, has very specific rules that talk about putting these DPOs, these data protection officers, in place, and the type of authority they would have within the organizations. And finally, data transfer. If any of the information gets transferred outside of the European Union, so if you're in South America or North America and you're collecting personal information, or they must now be transferred outside of your jurisdiction, there are specific rules that need to be applied in order to make sure that this gets done properly. Well, these are sort of obligations of the organization that needs to be looked at in order to be able to make sure that those apply. Moving on, next slide. So in the first, in the slides just prior to this, we talked about GDPR as a general concept, the general, what is personal data, what is processing, who are the actors, the controllers, the clients, and the processors, the vendors that are associated with this. But all this, are concepts that need to be applied in the practical terms. And so in order for us that are involved with putting together solutions for our client, when we need to put in place what we call, the privacy by design. So it's important that, when the solution is architected for our customers, that privacy by design is first and foremost as part of the actual solutioning. And what do we mean by this? Well, what we need is that businesses that want to be compliant with the GDPR will have to design either policies, procedures, or systems that will comply with the legislation. So it's not only about the back end, so making sure that we provide traceability of every step of the way, and that we are able to retain the information and obtain the proper grounds and legal grounds that the consent has been given. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that we follow sort of these six stages, if you want, in order to make sure that we answer the compliancy that we're looking for. So what do we mean by privacy by design? Well, privacy by design really means conducting an impact assessment. I talked about that as sort of a DPIA. So the impact assessment will ensure that the processing is understood. Are we talking about personal data? If we are, how long are we going to keep that personal data? What type of personal data are we going to be handling? So all these elements are important to understand, and those are sort of the first step in ensuring that compliancy by conducting an impact assessment. The second step in ensuring that designing a solution that has privacy in mind is limit the data collection. So what we mean here is minimizing what is being collected so that the personal information is kept securely. So for instance, if we're collecting information for a newsletter, for instance, collecting a person's first name, last name, and email address is probably the only thing that is required. If we start to say, well, we need his home address, and we need the name of his wife or his kids, and we need to be able to know what his blood type is. If all this information is asked for, and there's no real reason to collect this information, then that's what this means, limiting the data collection. Only to collect the data based on the process and the purpose for which the data has been collected. So that's the second component in designing a solution with privacy in mind. Number three, limiting the who sees the data. So even within your activities as you're developing the solution, if you've got the full development team that has access to the data and they don't need to have access to the data, if you don't have a dedicated DBA that is responsible for the data, and everybody else has access to it, then you would probably be in breach of the GDPR legislation. So here what we mean is that as you're defining the solution, ensure that the people that only need to have access to the actual database have access to the database. So you don't necessarily want your QA people or your full development team to have access to the database if only one person needs to have access to that. So keeping in mind who has access to that, in ensuring that when you're defining the actual solution, you keep track of that. We talked about record keeping. So all through the process of processing the personal data, you must provide evidence along the way, and that evidence may be code stamps, anything that you will be able to provide evidence in the event of a data breach, or in the event that you being questioned to say, hey, show me how you're able to obtain consent. When did you get consent? Where do you store this information? So proper record keeping is definitely important in this scenario. Limiting the processing here, what we mean is processing is limited to the purpose for which the data was collected. Again, making sure that we only collecting the information and we're processing only the information that we've received consent for. So for instance, if I've received consent to process my information for receiving a newsletter, I cannot use that consent or that personal data to then use it for another marketing campaign that the user has not given their consent for. So the marketing campaign here would not be applicable, and therefore this scenario or this solution that we're defining for the client would not apply in this event. And finally, continuous assessment. So checking to ensure that your ongoing confidentiality is maintained. So as we know, as the client relationship evolves and as we build new versions or we add to the solution that we've initially defined for the client, we need to continuously look at the privacy aspect of the data to ensure that we're not opening a breach or that we're not causing some concerns about personal data that we've collected, so that we're respecting the privacy of our EU citizens along the way. So that's privacy by design. Let's move on to the next. I'll quickly go through the data protection principles, and here what I really want to sort of emphasize is that the legislation has been put together in order to be able to make sure that the data principles that have been put together has been focused on protecting the individual information. And this is super important these days with the digital world that we are sort of living in every day, and we have new technology that comes about, and it's all cool, but at the same time, it's also putting in and exposing a lot of personal data to users. And so this legislation has sort of been put together to ensure that they're sort of nine key principles have been respected when we're talking about data protection for the users. So it's a bit of a important to understand what these fundamentals in order to appreciate why this legislation came about. So the first one is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So what we're saying here is personal data is really about being fair and transparent about individuals' personal data, because it's about individuals and individuals data. It's important to understand that this data this law has been created to protect that the individual's privacy. The second principle is about purpose of limitation. So personal data can only be processed to achieve an express purpose. I'm collecting my personal information to process for a specific newsletter, and that's it. So the purpose has been defined, and therefore it has a very specific purpose, a very specific limitation. The third principle here is data minimization. Collect only the data necessary for the defined purpose. So there's no need to collect home address if all you're doing is asking someone to sign up to a newsletter, for instance. Moving on to the next slide, please. We talk about accuracy. Again, data must be kept up to date. It's especially important when dealing with when we need to provide proof of compliancy. So here, again, it's important that the data that we're collecting is up to date. And if it's not up to date, if it's outdated data or names that we've got in the database, it needs to be deleted from the database. The principle of integrity. So devices and procedures need to be in place to ensure personal data is stored safely. It's important criteria when talking about privacy by design. So the integrity of the solution, making sure that there is no compromise, that the data is properly anonymized or pseudonymized, so that we're making sure that we're complying with the various principles of the GDPR legislation. Limited storage. This has to do with the shelf life of the data. No longer is it possible that we've collected names 3 years ago from a trade show that we can still use it today. So again, the shelf life of the data is defined here, so that we cannot use data over and over again without people's knowing about or why they've collected the information. Next slide, please. So personal data is tied to individuals, so by extension, it becomes part of their personality. So this is why it's important that this legislation is all about. So we're not talking about strictly just data or bits and bytes in the world of the internet. We're actually saying that personal data, these bits and bytes and personal information collected around the world, we leave digital footprints everywhere we go, and that digital footprint is also tied to me as an individual. So what they've done is they've extended out that concept of personal data, and personal data about the individuals. The next concept is territorial principle, and here the idea here is that personal data from Europeans must reside with the European citizens where they reside, and that is in Europe. But the concept here is that users travel, and what they do is that data sometimes gets transferred from one organization to another, or from one branch or one division of another. And this is especially important when we're talking about global organizations that may have a footprint or a presence in multiple countries and multiple cities, and therefore the data may get transferred. Maybe marketing is in Europe and then sales is in North America, and they're transferring information from one jurisdiction to another. So there's specific principles that need to be respected when transferring data from one territory to another. And then the concept of accountability. So controllers must provide evidence. So the clients here must provide evidence to how personal data is stored and processed within their facilities, and moving away from voluntary compliance. In the past, we've always had the concept of, the clients or the controllers would be responsible for compliancy. Now this law basically steps in and everybody must comply with that legislation. So it's important that accountability along the way is respected. So that's those are sort of the 9 principles that have sort of formed the legislation that we now sort of must deal with on a day-to-day basis. All right. Understanding processing. So when we talked about legislation and privacy, we talked about the fact that there is only 6 specific grounds, legal conditions a controller, so our clients here, our controller, can manipulate, process, or have in their possession personal data on EU citizens. So the 6 principles are such. They must obtain consent. The principle of consent, the processing. So the next principle is necessary for the performance of a contract. Then the third one is necessary for complying with legal obligations, necessary for protection of vital interests of an individuals, or the necessary for the performance of a task carried out in the public interest, or necessary for legitimate interests. So here, when we're processing personal information, there's only 6 legal grounds in which an organization can actually process information, and those 6 legal grounds are here. If you or your clients that you're dealing with are processing personal data outside of these 6 legal grounds, then you are offside of the processing of the GDPR legislation. So let me get into examples of what I mean by these 6 processing or legal grounds for processing of personal information. Next, move on to the next slide, please. So what do we mean by consent? So consent is the easiest one because it basically asks the user their consent for their personal data. So Danielle Robert, do you consent on giving your name for receiving a newsletter from us as an organization? Yes, I give you my consent. You are now able to send me personal information. So that's pretty simple. It's transactional. Do you consent? Yes, I consent. You keep track of that. You send them the information. So that's a simple way. So if you've got the consent, and you will see more and more of this information, more and more of these pop-ups that will come up on websites, especially in sort of large organizations, is that, do you consent to provide information? We are collecting cookies on information. Do you provide consent to basically for us to collect that information? So we'll see more and more of this as the legislation takes effect after May 25th. The second legal ground for processing is legal obligations. So here, you as an organization may be collecting tax information, personal information, in order to be able to record taxes withheld for salary. So here, in this example, a controller may be collecting information from their employees, and their employees are all European citizens, and therefore they don't necessarily need to have the consent of the employee, because the organization has an obligation to the tax authorities to provide information about the employee's salary so that they get taxed when they get taxed by the legal authority there. So that's what we mean by all legal obligations. There may be also the ability, the legal grounds for performance of a contract. So I sign up to get to buy a laptop from Amazon.com. I will provide them with personal information about who I am, my credit card information, my personal address to receive the product from Amazon. So Amazon does not need my consent to send me to collect that information because they are performing a contract. You provided them with a credit card. In return, they provide you with a laptop. So they are performing a contract. You're exchanging goods, information, or money for a product. That is called performance of a contract. So if you are an organization that transacts with users and you're collecting personal information, you don't need the consent. You have the personal contract that you must fulfill in order to be able to do that processing. Vital interest. So for instance, I drive a vehicle, and in my vehicle, I have an OnStar service. I crash my vehicle, I'm in a ditch, I'm in need of assistance. The service that I'm subscribed to from a vital interest perspective is able to send me an ambulance and a tow truck in order to be able to get me out of the ditch. They will provide that service because they're doing it in the vital interest of my person. So that's another grounds for legitimate grounds for processing of that information. The fifth one is public interest. The public interest here is that if there are floods or a tornado or a catastrophe that is happening in my region, maybe you have an organization that is responsible to alert you to say, please evacuate, there's a tornado coming or there's a flood, you need to evacuate your residents. And so they may contact me through my cell phone because they already have that personal information with them, and so therefore they would be able to provide assistance to me or my family in order to be able to avoid that disaster. And then the last ground is legitimate interest. Here is like legitimate interest. Sometimes it is a legal grounds that is being used that is not necessarily very easy to prove. Organizations that is trying to sell me information cannot use that legitimate interest to be able to process my information, because what they're doing is they're looking at them for saying it's the interest of my company to send you information about my products. But then you can argue that, well, it's not in the interest of the individual to receive that information. So here, information is important. That legitimate interest has to be managed very carefully, because it's a bit of a gray area that would be a bit more difficult to actually talk about processing of that information. All right, next slide, please.
All right, I guess that's it for you. And thanks for the explanation and the foundation for GDPR, Daniel. And as I presented myself earlier, Vinicius is going to continue with the presentation about Sitecore and GDPR. So as Daniel mentioned, GDPR is a hot topic these days because we are reaching up the deadline for apply and be compliant for that. So what does that mean for Sitecore if you have Sitecore installed? So for those who use Sitecore on daily basis, you know that Sitecore has a unique architecture that supports the ability to isolate all aspects of customers' interactions through profile settings, implicit behaviors, and explicit interactions, which means that behind the scenes, Sitecore understands the value of customer data and the importance of protecting it. Based on that, you might be asking yourself about the compliant versions for Sitecore. And at this stage, close to the due date, as I just mentioned, it's on May 25th. You probably want to know which Sitecore version is compliant with GDPR. And here's the good answer. From 6 to 9, all versions are compatible and adjustable to become compliant with GDPR. However, as Daniel explaining a lot about GDPR, it's imperative that you first understand which areas of your configure implementation needs your attention. So keep that in mind.
Just one thing I want to mention though is that It's important to understand here that when I said GDP, the compliancy of GDPR is not strictly based on a technology or a tool. It's an internal process. It's the ability for the organization to ensure that they've got their internal operations created in order to be able to apply or to comply with GDPR legislation. I'll give you a quick example. Just because you have a technology that allows you to safeguard data and you has the ability to process the information, and you may have the ability to provide evidence along the way of all the activities associated with that, that in itself is not enough. So if I am a customer of the organization, for instance, and I want to say, hey, tell me what information do you have about Danielle Roberge? Sitecore may not necessarily do it all for you. They have to have, the organization has to have in place someone to send an email to, someone either that will answer the complaint to say, oh, Danielle Roberge is asking to see what information we have in our database. Then they could go say, oh yes, we have the tool in order to be able to query the database and see, oh, Danielle Roberge is entered in our database on May 25th. He provided consent and all that stuff. So that's all good. But it's important that you understand that it's not just about the technology. It's also about the process you have within the organization in order to be able to reply to users that are coming to, with a complaint or a query or a question about the personal data that may be stored in a solution or in a technology that is at your clients.
Yeah, exactly. And in summary, this does not mean that if you have Sitecore, you are GDPR compliant at all. You have to make adjustments in your Sitecore configuration and make sure that all the obligations and all the things that GDPR implies are adjustable to your Sitecore configuration. So yeah, that's the way it is. And keep in mind that just having Sitecore or other technology that is compliant with the GDPR, this does not mean that you are already compliant. You probably need some adjustments. All right, moving forward with that. So this is the question I would like to raise for you guys. Is Sitecore 9 the way to go? Because the other thing is, isn't all Sitecore from 6 to 9 compliant with GDPR? So why do I even care about that? So yeah, you are right. I just said that about Sitecore 6 to 9 be compliant with GDPR. So what would be the difference in upgrade to Sitecore 9? You may ask yourself right now. So it's a kind of simple question, a simple answer, sorry. It's effort. The effort that you have on an old version would be way higher than Sitecore 9. And again, it's simple. Bear with me while I continue my presentation, but we'll be back to this point and use Sitecore 7.5 as an example, okay? So Daniel also mentioned about privacy by design and privacy by default. Privacy by design only. But Sitecore uses those two arguments to say that Sitecore 9, it's built on privacy by design and privacy by default. So despite the fact that Sitecore is a unique architecture and GDPR ready with all versions, again, from 6 to 9, Sitecore is the one who brings a number of privacy by design and privacy by default principles and new features that will allow you to comply with legislation. Any comments on that, Daniel? Nope. Okay.
Sorry, no, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah. So just, I guess it reiterates the point that it's not just about the technology; it's also about the whole process and within the organization. So.
Okay, good. So moving forward. So one of the principles that Sitecore brought to the table for GDPR, it's XConnect. So it's basically one of the keys for privacy by design and privacy by default is the famous XConnect, which was first introduced on last October during Sitecore release. So for those who doesn't know, XConnect is a service layer that exists independently of Sitecore itself and does not have any dependency on Sitecore kernel, and sits in between XDB and any trusted client device or interface that wants to read, write, or search XDB data. And most important, communication must happen over HTTPS. So if you are asking yourself, also there is a no direct connection to the underlying database or search index, as the client application is only aware of XConnect endpoint. So that means that Sitecore provides an API, a connection to XConnect, and you will be able to query XConnect for couple information through an API, and no one has ability to search inside of XConnect at all, just Sitecore application through the API just that I just mentioned. Another thing that it's very important that Sitecore provides some information is the right of access. So in order to be compliant of the right of access, you will be using XConnect. So XConnect provides an API named getContactAsSync that allows you to retrieve a full contact profile for your end customer. I'm bringing this topic here because for all researches that I did about the GDPR, Sitecore, and moving forward, the right of access and the right to be forgotten was the two hot topics for that, and the two ones that XConnect is related to. So I thought that would be a good idea to bring those to my presentation. So the next one is the right to be forgotten, or it named as well as the right to erasure, and also known as the right to be forgotten. So also notice that this is the Article 17 of the GDPR legislation. And again, XConnect comes to the play and provides an API named execute right to be forgotten, which will anonymize contact by executing the following changes to a contact. Sorry. Deletes all identifiers, known and anonymous, clears all facets or facet properties marked as PAI sensitive, and also consent information executed right to be forgotten is set to true. So which means that the right to be forgotten, it's executed in the contact. Okay. So as I mentioned prior, for the example about the effort. So here's an example from the document that Sitecore has published about GDPR. So the document is named Ready, Set, No, GDPR compliance with Sitecore XP 8, 7, and 6. So this table shows a little bit about the effort that you have to do in order to get compliant with your Sitecore 7 or 7.5 with the right to erasure or the right to be forgotten. So in this table, you can see that Sitecore 7, 7.5, I will use the second line here where it starts with users on version 7.5 with XDB should be aware there is no product feature support out of the box for the right to erasure or portability. You need to customize and extend your 7.5 XDB solution to fulfill those requirements. And in the other hand, Sitecore 9 has dedicated features for the right of erasure or right to be forgotten. A contact's personal data can be deleted through a Sitecore API call execute right to be forgotten. So instead of manually doing a couple adjustments in your Sitecore solution, with Sitecore 9, you have the ability with an API that it's fully functional independently of Sitecore, and it sits between the XDB and the service call that Sitecore has to query when you need to execute something. So I know that this is pretty much for the Sitecore GDPR thing. And if you have any question for that. please let us know through our YouTube broadcast. Do you have anything to add, Daniel?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I have a question actually. I just wanted to make sure that with the Sitecore 9 features, GDPR features, I'm assuming that they provide evidence along the way, right? Like every API call that you make, there's going to be traces of proof that will be able to be called in order to be able to provide that to any asking organizations, correct?
Yeah, so as far as I recall about all the research that I did for this presentation, Sitecore provides a full table compliant about GDPR, and also mention about the full trace that you just mentioned about who did what, and if the user asks to be erasure, to be forgotten, and this it's all tracked on Sitecore.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions, guys?
All right. I will start. There are 3 questions in the channel, in the chat window. I will start with this. Since GDPR cannot be reached solely with technology, do you anticipate the need of a GDPR specialist to be hired to companies so they can be compliant, or maybe a GDPR validator or anything to determine if GDPR is being infringed?
So yeah, so let me answer that. So the what we're seeing is a lot of organizations are either assigning their own internal security officers to be GDPR representative. Some of them, larger organizations, are actually going to hire people to play the role as a data protection officer. But those are much larger organizations. Those organizations that do hire the DPO, data protection officer, will most likely be individuals with either a legal background or play a role that with some either a lawyer or having some legal background, because you're dealing with legislation here and understanding the roles of the organization. And what we're also seeing is organizations that are farming out or contracting out that role with either the law firm that they're already dealing with, in order to be able to set up that type of service with them to be able to comply, because either they can't afford to see this, or they can't afford to hire somebody internally. And it all comes down to the level of interactions that you believe your organization, or the level of exposure your organization is going to have with this legislation. If your organization is dealing with customers that are strictly South American or North American, and you have very little risk of exposure to European citizen, then this legislation really doesn't apply, and the efforts tied to it probably doesn't apply.
In addition to that, I saw some companies that already presented the GDPR and Sitecore webinars. Seems that we will probably find some tools that are being developed, being released in the next couple of days to validate if your Sitecore is compliant or not with the GDPR. Not entirely sure which companies are, because I don't recall from top of my mind. But the thing is, I believe very, very soon we will see more and more tools with that feature, because we are reaching out the due date for GDPR.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay. So one more question. I remember one principle you talked about, which was, I'm sorry, wire problems, which was about the right to not be reached only solely by automatic process.
Right.
I'm thinking about things like the implication of these things on personalization, which is something that shows some content for you automatically based on your navigation, or EXM mail campaigns. So how much do we need to develop, to customize code to be compliant with that?
So this is very, very apropos in the sense that it is imperative that organizations understand the type of processing. So when we talk about, so if you're going to be personalizing content for a user, what does that mean? So what legal grounds are you going to rely your processing on in order to be able to deliver personal information to that user? So you know, can you claim legitimate interest? Can you claim vital interest? Can you claim legal interest? If you can't, then you're going to, the only other means that you're going to be able to process is through consent. So how are you going to craft or obtain that consent from that user? And I'll just give you a quick example. So you may go to a website and you say, a pop-up comes up and says something that our website now is collecting information, and based on the information that we're collecting from your browsing activities, we seek your consent in order to be able to customize and to personalize the information that you're going to consume on our website. And then you ask for that consent. If you don't get that, then either the site does not provide personalization based on either cookies or behaviors or any type of other information you may be collecting. So again, the idea here is that if you are going to be leveraging tools like available like Sitecore, the whole personalization engine, then you need to think through how you're going to be able to legitimize that behavior with your users.
Yeah, and
it's not an easy thing to say. I'm not, you know, this whole legislation, GDPR legislation, is being imposed on everybody. It's being imposed on we as vendors. You know, you, if you're a client and you're a customer, you need to be able to deal with that. Everybody is impacted on this. And one thing that I've not mentioned is that this legislation is somewhat unique from other legislation, is in that it comes to the table with very strict and very expensive penalties, up to 20 million euros or 4% of your global revenue can be imposed as a fine if you do not comply with GDPR. So this is one of the first legislation where you've got such strict penalties that come into play.
Yeah, and another thing that Rodrigo's question was very specific to Sitecore. So Sitecore provides provided so far two documents regarding GDPR. One it's pretty much related with Sitecore 9, and the other one it's the one that I quoted here for Sitecore 8, 7, and 6. So over there you find a similar table where you'll be able to find the EXM and also the personalization that you just mentioned. So I would suggest you to have a quick look over there and get your insights for GDPR compliance.
This is Posso falar? Tá aberto? First of all, this is Diego here. First of all, great presentation, Vinicius and Dan, Roberge, great stuff. I guess one of my questions is really related to what was just, you know, what we're discussing here is, I think one of the slides that Daniel presented was about limiting the processing of the user data, right? What I'm thinking here is how can you limit that, you know, to the purpose of why that data was collected in a system like Sitecore, where at the same time that you're collecting that data, you want to make a more intelligent use of that data with personalization, with Sitecore Cortex, you know, all of these AI stuff that Sitecore is bringing to the table to actually provide a more intelligent and a more, with a more intelligent, really, experience for the user, where we're actually capturing the user data to try to deliver the best experience possible, but at the same time, you do have this limiting of how much you can do with that. So I guess really my question is, how far can we go, and how far can this legislation limit, in limit the the system and what we're trying to deliver really with Sitecore? I'm not sure if it's clear or not, but really, being at the last symposium, it was clear that Sitecore is going towards this direction. We're going to have Sitecore Cortex. AI is the future. We all know that, but at the same time, now we have a legislation that actually tells us we got to be careful with what we're doing with that data. So I guess my question really is, what can we do about it? And
Yep. Yeah, and I think this is definitely the paradigm that we're living in, right? Because technology is advancing so quickly, and we can start, with AI being sort of the wave of the future, and the technology, there's things that are coming down the pipe that we don't even, aren't even aware of, that could, improve our lives, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the whole point with this legislation. This legislation has come into effect because we can do so much with personal information that individuals are losing their capacity or their understanding of what is being collected about themselves, and technology is almost taking over. And so what this legislation is meant to do is put some brakes on, and empower and putting the responsibility back to the controllers, the users that are going to be collecting the information, to be able to say, okay, hang on, just because the technology can do all this stuff, let's think clearly about why we're collecting the information, what personal information are we obtaining, and let's think through how to go about doing it in such a way that we're not infringing on individuals' privacy rights. And so, yes, we can look at it from a perspective and say, listen, this legislation is really impeding our ability to advance technology and to personalize and to create rich experiences using Sitecore. But at the same time, it's saying, well, okay, let's hold on for just a second. Let's pause for a minute, and let's understand what we're trying to do here, and let's understand and put a priority on people's personal data versus the priority on the technology. Just because the technology is allowing us to do all these cool things, we need to take a break and make sure that we understand. Sorry, I apologize. We need to understand what the impact of this technology will be on individuals' rights. So, like I said before, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge for everybody. And I think what it does is that it's a challenge for everyone, and it's not necessarily making our competitors advance more than we are. It's just that we have the ability now to make sure that we have to think this through a bit more, and to be able to understand how to navigate that. And I think that's what's going to happen. Is I think we're going to be in a situation where everybody is going to have to think it through. And technology, the way that technology is going, maybe at the same time there's going to be innovation about the technology in order to be able to allow for the respect or the further respect of people's individual rights.
Yeah, and in addition to that, my personal opinion for Diego's question is like, this is something about legislation, and it's not the rule for the future. Let's say that at some point we notice as people in an organization that this is avoiding us to improve technology because we are not able to collect or personalize any data. And at some point we notice that GDPR is not something to keep going. So probably in the future, some needs to be fulfilled, and we need to change those articles and regulations. That's my personal opinion, that in future we might ended up finding out that we are getting stuck due to legislation, and that's not the intention at this moment for GDPR. However, I guess at some point we will notice that personal data, it's right now personal data is something important, and people need to be aware where your data and your profile is being recorded and how to deal with those. So I guess this is the way things are moving forward now. So Diego, second question.
My second question is one of the topics that was brought is also that in order for you to transfer your data to outside of the union, European Union, there are some rules and restrictions on how you can do that. How can that work, or how can we actually achieve in a realistic situation when we have, for example, geolocated targets in cloud? For example, you have Azure with data centers across the globe, where your data is essentially all across the globe, right? In data centers in the United States, Europe, Asia, and so on. And at the same time, for it to be compliant, how does that really, how can you actually be compliant with GDPR and at the same time be working on a world where Azure is not the future, is the present, right? So, not sure if Vinicius, if you want to address that.
Well, I can take a stab at this. I think what's important to understand is that the processing of the data. So if we're going to be storing the data in a cloud hosted environment, these people become co-processors with you if you're the vendor. So it's important to understand what their GDPR compliances are, understand which data center you're actually storing the data, where is it, if there's a redundancy, a backup system put in place, where are they located, what are the sort of the measures taking in place that you're taking in place in order to make sure that the data that is safeguarded in Ireland, for instance, is properly safeguarded, et cetera, et cetera. So it's about understanding where your data is going, understanding who has access to it. It's understanding if it's being transferred, what's the transmission protocols, what are the security protocols tied to that transmission. It's all of that, and that's all part of the design of the solution in order to make sure that you keep track of all the activities that are tied to your data. And so it's not about only the transmission, it's not only about the storage, but it's everything, all about that as well.
Yeah, another thing is that if you are a Twitter user, Facebook, not sure if Facebook right now, but Twitter and Azure and other cloud platforms, you may notice or may receive an email saying that the policy and legislation about that particular tool has changed, and you have to accept it or at least read through. So I accessed my Twitter this morning, and I had a big warning in my screen saying that legislation was about to change, and in order to continue, I have to accept those. So I believe that using Azure, or if you have a storage container in Europe, or using a geo-replicated solution, you probably receive a notification for that as well. But I believe that you should receive some things to be aware that you are using something based in Europe, and you will be GDPR laws will be applicable for your situation. Any other questions, guys? Twitter, YouTube, nothing? Just a second. Yeah, and I would like to also raise the point that I speak with some Sitecore folks about GDPR, and the answer that I received is that Sitecore provided 2 documents so far. It's simple, just Google it about Sitecore and GDPR, you'll find those documents. Probably, yeah, so I will post in the description of the video as soon as it goes online. The other thing is that Sitecore has an email address if you have Sitecore GDPR questions related. So it's privacy@sitecore.com. So if you have any questions regarding Sitecore and GDPR, you can mail through that. It's listed on Sitecore official website. So if you guys don't have any other question or further discussion to go, I would like to first thank you, Daniel, for being with to present for us the GDPR Foundation. Good explanation. We appreciate that, and also taking myself. No, okay. So so applause, everyone. Thank you. No, and thank you, and have a great night.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you, Vinicius. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, João. He must be sleeping and dreaming at this point. Thanks, everyone online. That was our second Sitecore User Group Brazil this year. Next date yet to be defined, probably next July, probably. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, we'll confirm that. Keep tuned, and we talk later. See ya. Bye-bye.